Hi, Aki.
Hi, Zeinab.
So, Aki, what would you like to know about this history series that I'm doing?
What made you want to do the series?
Really, it was actually an accident. I was in the offices of UNESCO talking to the Deputy Director General, Getachew Ngida, who's from Ethiopia, and I noticed in his bookcase that there were these volumes of Africa's history. And I remembered that I'd seen one of the volumes when I was doing some research myself on ancient Sudan, and I got talking to him and said, look, this is UNESCO's best kept secret, the fact that you've got these history volumes written by Africans about Africa's history. So that's really how the idea came to me, and from there I thought it would be great to try to somehow bring these volumes to life, take them off the shelves and bring them into people's living rooms so that they could actually experience Africa's history with me, and that's how it came about.
So, what was the thinking behind the general history of Africa?
This was a project which was conceived in the early 1960s during that period of rapid decolonisation in Africa, when the newly independent African presidents said, look, we've decolonised our countries, we want to decolonise our history, because it's either been written by outsiders, denigrated, or we've been told we don't have any. And so they hatched a plot. UNESCO was approached, and UNESCO said, fine, we will facilitate this process for you. So they scoured the continent of Africa for the best experts across a field of disciplines, archaeology, paleontology, anthropology, you name it. And they used sources which Western historians traditionally hadn't looked at, you know, Arabic, Swahili, Hindi, Gujarati, Persian. And so they compiled volume after volume of Africa's history, starting with prehistory, volume 1, The Origins of Humankind, and they ended with 8 volumes, and that took us to about the early 1990s. But they've picked up the project again, and they are writing the 9th volume as well as updating the previous 8, and so hopefully the project has now had life breathed into it, and it's going to bring us up to where we are now.
So, how come there's been no publicity about this? It sounds like a really important piece of work.
The volumes themselves contain a whole wealth of knowledge, but they're not very accessible because they're obviously scholarly works written by great scholars of Africa, and so the language isn't always, the information is there, but it's quite difficult to extract. So I think that my approach with the documentaries is to say, look, this project does exist. I base my facts on it because obviously history is contested, so if there are dates which are different from what the general history of Africa, which is what the volumes are called, if they have a date but there's a different date elsewhere, then I will go with the dates of the general history of Africa. Where I can, I will draw on expert opinion from the volumes, the original contributors, if they're still alive, or if they're not, then people who have carried on their work. So I think that that's the main reason why it's not very well known, is because the material isn't in a very accessible form. So hopefully people will be interested in knowing more, both about the volumes, but also more about history. I consider myself a kind of entry-level historian. You're not going to get everything in the volumes, obviously, in a TV program. That's just not possible. But what you will find is that these documentaries will excite your interest so that you'll want to know more. The documentaries will tell you a lot about Africa that you didn't know about. And I think the third objective for me also is to entertain people. You know, this word edutainment, where you educate as well as provide some entertainment. So it is, I hope, an enjoyable experience, but one where you can also learn a lot.
Who are you hoping will watch this?
I think that this is something that should be watched by Africans and non-Africans alike. Africans, so that they can be aware that they have a very rich history, and a history that they can be proud of. And it doesn't matter if there's a program which is looking at a part of Africa from which you're not. You're from West Africa, Aki, but I would hope that you would enjoy the programs which tell you about the Kingdom of Aksum, which is from East Africa, because this is a Pan-African project. It is something for all Africans to enjoy and to celebrate. So that's what I hope to achieve with the African audience. For the non-African audience, I would like them to be aware that there is this rich, historic, cultural heritage of Africa about which they probably know very little. Everybody knows a little bit about ancient Egypt and perhaps other little bits here and there, but this is a fairly comprehensive, chronological review of Africa's history.
What have you learned by doing this?
I think for me, because I was born in Africa, I was originally, I was born in the Sudan, I've always, of course, been aware of African history. So I think for me, it was really confirming what I always sort of knew somewhere at the back of my mind, that this story of Africa's history hasn't really been told in a very comprehensive, clear, simple way. So I think that is what I've learnt from it. It's confirmed what I've always known, that there is this great history. Because, you know, in Sudan, when I was a little girl and we'd go back on holiday regularly, we'd be taken to see the pyramids of Sudan. And you know, I would ask my relatives, what do we know about these pyramids and the other monuments and the statues outside the National Museum in Khartoum? You drive past them, you know, every time you went by. And I always thought, there's something there, you know, that I just really want to find out more. I was very, very curious. So now with this series, boy, is my curiosity sated.
I understand that you've used African film crews everywhere you filmed. What difference does it make, if it makes any at all?
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, we thought long and hard about it. We wanted uniformity in our pictures. And so it was a big gamble, really, to use a different TV crew for every country that we went to. But I think we felt that it was important that we used a local crew wherever we went. And that gamble really has paid off, because they are some fantastic, really talented young men and women in Africa who are working in the media at the moment. And it made a big difference because, first of all, they are familiar with their country. In some cases, they'd already been to the sites that we wanted to film, so they had that prior knowledge, which was very, very important, because we wouldn't have been to those places ourselves. Because they were local, they knew about the weather conditions, whether it might rain, so we'd have to rush to do something. Also the light, when the light would change. But the biggest difference it made is when it came for me to interview people in these countries, particularly those who are not experts, just ordinary men, women and children. If there was a local cameraman pointing the camera at them, he would speak in their local language and say, look, I'm just, you know, relax and do this. And they'd feel, very, you know, much more at ease than if I'd had a crew I'd brought with me from the United Kingdom to film them. So that was a huge, huge advantage. And then the other thing is that the enthusiasm of the local crew. They were so happy that we were there to film their country's history. So there's a great deal of pride, and it meant they worked jolly hard, actually.
Did you interview only academics from Africa?
Yes, I only interviewed African academics because that really was following the principle established by the General History of Africa, the volumes on which the series derives its facts. And so it doesn't matter if you're an African academic who might be based in the United Kingdom or in the United States, although I have to say that practically everybody we interviewed was actually based at an academic institution in the country that we were interviewing them in. But I thought that it was important that we had Africans talking about their history and not just sort of rolling in the customary, you know, non-African historian to sum up a country's history for us. I mean, there are some wonderful, don't get me wrong, there's some wonderful non-African academics who are absolute, you know, masters of their history, treat the subjects in a very, very sensitive way. But I just thought that this was a project which really warranted the use of just African academics. And it didn't matter if you were white, black, brown, the main thing is you had to be Africans.
You wear the same shirt in all the programs. Why is that?
Well, you know, I bought 8 of the same shirts and 5 of the same jackets so that I would have continuity and not annoy people watching these programs by having, you know, a fashion show wearing something different each time. But I have to say, yes, no, I'm not wearing the same shirt day in, day out. They are different ones, but all identical.
As a young African, my knowledge of the history of Africa only starts as far back as the early 20th century or the independence of my country, Nigeria. Do you see a space for this in the school curriculum?
So here you are, you see, Aki, you know, a highly intelligent young Nigerian, went to school in Nigeria and studying at a fine academic institution in the United Kingdom. And you have said what so many Africans, young Africans have said to me is, you know what, when it comes to African history or even the country, history of our own country, can't really go much beyond independence, which takes you to the early 20th century. And they might know a little bit about slavery. So this is a real antidote to that. This does take you back to centuries BC. And obviously when you go so far back, there weren't countries like Nigeria or Ghana or, you know, Senegal or whatever. So that's why we look at the region. But, and that's why it is a Pan-African project, because you've got to look at the continent in a holistic way and not just say, I'm Nigerian, therefore I'm only interested in Nigeria or what became Nigeria and West Africa. So I would hope that you would want to know about the whole continent, just as we talk about European history, African history, so that you share in the history of the whole continent, and you might pay more attention to West Africa because that's your particular region. But what you say is no different from so many other highly educated Africans. They just don't know about their history. And sometimes it's even worse, Aki, because I have older Africans who've been taught in the colonial era. For example, a former president of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, said to me, you know what, Zeinab? I can actually recite the names of British medieval kings, and I can't go that far back with my own history. So I'm not saying it's wrong to know about Western history. Of course, it's good to have, you know, knowledge about so many things, but you've got to know about your own history.
What's in the programs?
We start with program 1, which is called Mother Africa. And actually, interesting enough, I say this is the history of Africa, but program 1 is in a category of its own because it's looking at the origins of humankind. So actually, that program is about everybody's history because we all originated in Africa. So that's looking at, you know, theories of evolution and so on, and we filmed in Eastern and Southern Africa mostly because these are the two regions of Africa where the most fossil discoveries have been made, which suggests that we emerged from probably from East Africa. At the moment, the claim for East Africa is greater than that for Southern Africa. But, you know, this particular area is constantly, you know, being updated because new finds are being made all the time. But as things stand, the Eastern claim is higher. Program 2, you know, for 99% of our history, we lived as hunter-gatherers, and that's what we look at in Program 1, you know, what you might call the Stone Age, when we lived through from what we hunted and what we gathered. Program 2 looks at that 1% of human history when we changed from being hunter-gatherers. It's called Cattle, Crops and Iron, and it looks at when we began to domesticate animals and when we became farmers and when the Iron Age came to Africa and really transformed agriculture on the continent. Program 3 really starts the journey we make looking at the great civilizations of Africa, the urban civilizations, starting with ancient Egypt, which everybody knows about, but I hope that we bring something a bit different to the table, and it's not just looking at the wonderful jewelry that the pharaohs had. Program 4 is the Kingdom of Kush, and that is modern-day northern Sudan, where I'm from originally, and that looks at this little-known aspect, actually, of Africa's history, the kings of Kush, who, at the zenith of their power in the 8th century BC, defeated Egypt and ruled it for the best part of a century, and also were a bit of a superpower in the region. Program 5 and 6 look at the Kingdom of Aksum, the rise of the Kingdom of Aksum and the fall of the Kingdom of Aksum, which are we're looking at mostly Ethiopia and Eritrea today. And then Program 7 looks at North Africa, who were the original inhabitants of North Africa, the Berbers, of course, everybody's heard of the Berbers, and so that's the area we examine in Program 7. And Program 8 looks at the arrival of the monotheistic religions in Africa, Judaism, Christianity and Islam in that order. We tend to think that monotheism, Christianity in particular, didn't arrive until the 19th century, mostly with the missionaries and the colonizers, but actually it was present on the continent much, much earlier than that. And Islam, of course, also came earlier. I mean, you know, we filmed for that particular program in East Africa, Zanzibar, in West Africa, Senegal, for instance, as well as obviously the Islamic dynasties in the north of Africa. But I would hope that when you see the first series that there is a relatively fair representation of countries that we visited in north, south, east and west. There are some parts of Africa, of course, which are not safe for us to go to, Libya, for instance, and parts of Chad and so on and so forth. So it doesn't mean that we've managed to go to every one of the 54 countries. Of course not, that wouldn't be possible. We've tried to go to countries where there is a lot to see, but I would hope that it would give a fairly accurate representation of the history in that particular era of the continent, and always guided by what the volumes in the General History of Africa say. So you'll all have to watch and let us know what you think.
Looking forward to it. Thank you very much, Zeinab. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thanks very much indeed.
No problem, Zeinab.
Thank you. Thank you
My
for
pleasure.
talking to me, Aki.